This is lesson 56 and we're still doing fiscal policy, and right here the main thing we're going to look at right now is the crowding out effect, which is a pretty important part of the reasons why the government may not want to spend as much money. Anyway, just a bit of background here. We have a thing called national debt as a percentage of GDP, and the national debt as a percentage of GDP in the UK right now is about 90%. Right. In terms of national debt, we have two rules. So we have a sustainable investment rule, national debt not more than 40% of GDP. That was the rule that Gordon Brown made in, I think it was 1997, and that our national debt would not become more than 40% of GDP. Right now, of course, our national debt is about 90% of GDP, as I've just said. Now, the Eurozone also had a rule, and that rule was that national debt should not be more than 60% of GDP. Italy has now got debt of about 130% of GDP. Greece, if it wasn't bailed out, would have an even bigger debt than that, maybe about 150, 160% of GDP. And even Germany's got a national debt of more than 80% of GDP. And Germany does not like to break rules, but it's had to break rules when we had the Great Recession of 2008. So fundamentally, in the year 2000, when Labour first got elected in 1997, they made it pretty clear that they wanted to prove themselves in terms of economic policy. So therefore, they ran a budget surplus for those first 2 years, and national debt fell down to 30% of GDP. But then the sort of spending era started to come about. Remember the nice decade, trade debt, national debt, consumer debt. And that basically increased to about 40% of GDP by the year 2007. And then, despite the fact that Gordon Brown said that he'd abolished boom and bust, we did get a massive bust in the year 2008. And then national debt has risen very, very quickly. So we're talking there 7 years later, national debt has risen by 50% of GDP, which is pretty scary. So that's what we're trying to do now. We're trying to get on top of our national debt. Now, actually, in the UK, we're still running pretty large budget deficits. And the budget deficit is how much debt you have per year. So, for example, in the year 2008, I think our budget deficit for that year is about £150 billion. So £150 billion was added on to our national debt. Now, if you can get your budget deficit down to zero, so run a budget balance, then in a sense we have that term called fiscal sustainability. It's almost as if we are running our economy without getting into even more and more debt. Maybe worth explaining that in the next video a little bit. Now, obviously, with loads of debt, you've got to pay interest on that debt. In the future, there may be higher taxes. And eventually, of course, there may be less foreign direct investment. Because you have loads of national debt, then other companies will realise that eventually taxes may have to go up, your country's not as stable, so therefore you may attract less foreign direct investment into your country. Okay, but there's this other concept here I want to talk about, which is the crowding out effect. Now, the crowding out effect, so every time we have a debt or an increase in debt, so for the year 2014, let's say the budget deficit's going to be £100 billion. Now, if it is £100 billion, the government needs to sell bonds. Of course, it could just print money, but let's pretend for a moment they print bonds. Now, if you're an individual, and there's 60 million individuals in the UK, you can either put your money into shares, banks, or bonds. Okay? Now, one of the places you would probably want to put your money into anyway is you may want to buy government bonds, which is government debt. Why as an individual would you want to buy government debt? Well, the reason is this, is because the government will say, okay, every single year we're going to give you a rate of return of, say, 3%. And it's guaranteed. And then in 10 years' time, if you say buy a £1,000 bond, so every single year you get back £30 over a 10-year period, and then in 10 years' time you get your £1,000 back again. That is the government debt. You hold that debt because it's a very secure investment. Unless, of course, the government goes bust, but of course governments don't go bust. Well, Greece sort of went bust, so we've broken that rule, and this is part of the problem within Europe. Or you can put your money into shares, right, into the equity market is a pretty good place to put your money. Or you can give your money to a bank, and hopefully the bank will pay you a certain rate of interest, and then they will lend that money out to businesses. Now, the point is, if individuals have to go and buy loads of bonds to finance the government debt, okay, then you are taking money away from the private sector, because the private sector, if firms want to raise money, they sell more shares, and the private sector, if you want to borrow money, one of the first ports of call will obviously be the bank. So therefore, by the government having to sell more bonds, you are taking money away from the private sector, and that money is going to the government sector. And there's also a limited amount of funds in the market. So therefore, if there's a shortage of funds, by the simple law of demand and supply, so there's less funds available for the banks, then therefore they will increase their rate, quantity of funds down here. They will increase the rate of interest, and therefore the private sector will have to borrow at higher rates of interest. So here, if you sell more bonds, then the money's going to the government sector. The government sector is not as efficient as the private sector. And because you are moving resources into the government sector, it crowds out investment for the private sector. So that is one reason why the Tories do not like running budget deficits, which adds to national debt, because you are taking money away from the private sector and putting it into the government sector, and the government is not as efficient at spending money as the private sector. So that is a crowding out effect, as well as a little piece of information about the levels, etc., of national debt. Thank you. Okay, this is lesson 56, and when we're still on fiscal policy, which is obviously a pretty big subject area. But I'm just going to look at the idea of cutting government spending, and is it a good idea to cut government spending? Well, very, very simply, of course, if you cut government spending, as Greece had to do to try and balance its budget, then that leads to a decrease in government spending. Therefore, that leads to a decrease in AD, decrease in G, decrease in AD, and then the multiplying accelerator work in reverse, and that can obviously create an even bigger negative output gap as we go from there. That is the original negative output gap from there to there, and the output gap will then go from there to there. On top of that, of course, is as you decrease G, national income falls, you may get even less taxation revenue back. So even though you cut government spending, you get less taxation revenue back, and actually your national debt may get higher and higher and higher. And this, in a sense, is in fact what happened in some countries in Europe, but not in the UK. But we're going to come on to that in the next lesson when we look at fiscal contraction expansion. Okay, but there is a good argument for cutting government spending, and that is, if the government sells fewer bonds, then in a sense there's going to be more funds available for the banking sector, so they can have more money to lend out. If they have more money to lend out, that will mean that therefore they can reduce their rate of interest to the private sector. And they may even be able to offer lower mortgages for people who buy houses. Now, within the UK, there is a lot of consumer debt, particularly in mortgages, and there's also a lot of corporate debt. So the one thing you do not want to happen is for those two sectors to have higher rates of interest, because the banks haven't got much money to lend out. Because if that happens, that can create a crisis. If corporate firms go bust, then that's going to create unemployment. If consumers cannot service their debt because their loans are too big, that can create another fall in aggregate demand as well. So the idea of cutting G may well be quite a good one, because the government is selling less debt and taking less money away from the private sector. So therefore it's a good idea to have low levels of national debt and to try and increase the private sector. And then this leads on to the idea of fiscal sustainability, and Jeremy Warner's quote that the UK economy cannot recover until we have fiscal sustainability. Now, it's pretty tricky as to really what that word means, but it's basically, it means to me that the government is in control of its finances. So the government tries to create a budget balance, and the budget balance is when government spending is equal to taxation. A very rare event in the UK when we've not had a budget deficit. And the last time we had one was between 1997 and 1999, when the government ran a budget surplus, so therefore the national debt did in fact fall to about 30% of GDP in the year 2000. So we want to try and control government finances. So in essence, if the government does need to borrow money, it can then borrow money at low rates of interest. Because what you do not want in an economy, and which Europe is pretty scared of right now, is you do not want to have a banking crisis. Now you could have a banking crisis because imagine if the rate of interest went up, then households would get into trouble, house prices may start to fall, and the big firms may also get into trouble. So that can then create a banking crisis. And who normally bails out the banks? Well, it's got to be the governments. Well, the governments can't afford to bail out the banks because they've also, like the UK right now, we have 90% of national debt. So can we really afford to have another banking crisis? So if we have a banking crisis, then the government has to bail them out, but the government may also be in crisis because it may not have enough money to service its own debts. So therefore everything's in a little bit of a mess, which is the case right now in Europe. So if you can get fiscal sustainability, then that's a really, really good thing. Now, okay, I'm a big fan of the Green Party and I'm a member of the Green Party. However, the Green Party won't like this very much, is that I do believe in balancing your books, right? Eventually. But in the meantime, because our national debt is so large, if we try to balance the budget right now, it'd be very, very difficult. Unless, of course, we use printed money and then we can monetize the national debt and we can very, very quickly bring down that level of national debt. However, right, let's stick to the core economics. You're decreasing G, not a very good idea. Look at Greece, 25% fall in GDP, pretty serious stuff here. Okay, but if we do spend less money, the government doesn't need to raise as much money. Remember the crowding out effect from the previous lecture. So therefore we don't want to have higher interest rates because there's a lot of consumer debt around the UK, there's a lot of corporate debt around the UK, there's a lot of consumer debt in terms of mortgages. If you have to pay a high rate of interest, this could cause real problems to the economy. It could actually even cause another banking crisis. So what you want to try and aim for is fiscal sustainability, which is where you have budget balances and you are, I think a better term maybe is you are in control of your government finances. So the market knows that eventually you are going to get rid of the government debt. I hope I haven't just lost communication here because I've just been putting this plug out. Thank you.